tonight. Turn it like that a little bit. Of Genesis, that's where we left off. We are into Jacob and soon to be into Joseph, his favorite son. In between is a little chapter that we're going to skim through very quickly. But 35. Remember, Jacob has come back. He's met his brother. He was afraid of Esau because Esau said, I'm going to kill him. And everything is okay. And he has crossed over and he's back in the promised land. And so 35:1 says, and God said to Jacob, arise, go to Bethel and live there and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Now we can go back into 28, Genesis 28, beginning at verse 20. This is when Jacob is on his way to Paddan Aram, his mother's, Rebekah's family. He's going there. He's supposed to find a wife, and he comes in contact with God. It says, verse 20 and 28 says, Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I will take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my Jason. I saw him walking by. And I return to my father's house and say, then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you, God, give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. So he's made a covenant promise, you might say, with God, that God takes care of him, brings him back to his father's house. As he set that pillar up, he says, I'll give 10% to God of everything I have. And so God now says, I want you to go back to that spot, Bethel, that was called Bethel. You remember what I said Bethel means? House of God. So you've got Beth and then El. This means house. And this means God. Anywhere you see God in the Bible, somebody's name is referring to God. And so it's a house of God. It says, go back to Bethel, house of God. Verse 2, so Jacob said to his household, to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments, which is kind of a part of the purification or sanctification is what we go through process. Isn't it a shame, but yet we see it today? He had to tell his household, put away your false gods. But don't we see it today? I read a story a number of years ago about when missionaries went into Japan, and they were sharing Jesus, and the Japanese were just readily accepting Christ until the missionaries went into their home and found out they're just putting Jesus on the shelf with all the other gods. People in the United States are putting Jesus on the shelf with a bunch of other gods. God of family, God of wealth, God of cars, trucks, motorcycles, and boats, gods of pleasure or recreation. Yep, Jesus, I got you up there along with everything else. Some things don't change. Verse 3, he says, and let us arise, go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. Now let me see. Bethel is about 20 or so miles south of Shechem, which is where he's been. Verse 4, so they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. 5, so they journeyed there. As they journeyed, there was a great terror among the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Now, go back in the last chapter, is where Levi and Simeon kind of deceived Shechem and Hamor and the city and all the people who live there, and saying, if you want to marry our sister, everybody's got to be circumcised. And on the third day, because all the men were in pain, they killed everybody. Now, to me, that would mean if you are a distant cousin, that'd make you mad and sharpen your sword. But evidently, they feared them. And so the surrounding areas. But also, God's protecting. God would be the one who, in my opinion, put the fear in all the surrounding people around them to keep them from harming Jacob and descendants. Why? Well, what's God's plan for Jacob and his family? To become a great nation. And so that wasn't a part of God's plan. So verse 6. Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, it used to be called Luz, which was in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. He built an altar there, as God instructed, and he called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. So he told him to go to Bethel, but now, notice, El. Remember, this is God. So El, Bethel, means God of the house of God. Now think about that for a moment. A lot of people want to worship the house of God. But do we worship God of the house of God? This is God's house. We could say this is Bethel or Bethel. It's God's house. But it is the God of the house of God that we really need to be worshiping. One mission trip went into Mexico, and we went into a poor little town that had a Catholic church in the middle that probably cost more to build that one church than that town's people earned in 50 years combined. Because they, not just in Mexico, but you see, especially in a lot of Latin America, but it's the Catholic genre, you might say, going back to when they were building their cathedrals. They didn't build churches, they built cathedrals. They were very elaborate. They worship the house of God, not the God of the house of God. So he goes back, verse 8 says, now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the oak that was named Alon Bakuth, something along that line, meaning oak of weeping, oak of weeping. Then God appeared to Jacob again, verse 9, when he came from Paddan-aram, and he blessed him, and he said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name, one who struggles with God. Thus he shall call him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. So here God kind of repeating the promise, but now says not just many descendants, but kings shall be among your descendants. Verse 13. God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place. Now he's at Bethel. Set up a place where he's spoken to him with a pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it as to anoint the stone. So Jacob named the place where God has spoken with him Bethel, house of God. God always keeps his promises, but God, as you look verse 10 through 12, he'll repeat his promises often. So it just makes me feel like, akin to the people in the Bible days. They couldn't remember either. But God does. He lets us know in steps what we can handle, and he'll remind us even when we might forget. Verse 16, then they journeyed from Bethel when there was still some distance to go to Epathra, or is what I want to say, with the A on the end. It says, and Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. Now, Ephrath, my mouth don't want to work that way. You might know it better as Bethlehem. That was his original name, evidently, and was changed later. And of course, Bethlehem, Beth is bread, and Lahem, Beth is house, Lahem, or somewhere in the hymn anyway, is bread, so it's house of bread. 17, it came about that when she, which is Rachel, his favorite, was in severe labor, that the midwife said to her, do not fear, for now you have another son. It came about as her soul was departing, she died, that she named him, the son, Benoni, which is son of sorrow, but his father, Jacob, called him Benjamin, son of the right hand, which you might say that's kind of how he saw Rachel as his right hand, the love of his life, the one that he only wanted to be partnered with. So verse 19, Rachel died and was buried on the way to Epath, that is Bethlehem. Jacob set up a pillar over her grave, that is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Then Israel, notice Jacob, Israel, same person, just called by a different name, journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. It came about while Israel was dwelling in the land that Reuben, his oldest, went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. I read one footnote, that and you have to figure about this time that Reuben is probably in his 20s, and maybe he wants to dethrone daddy as far as being head honcho, so to speak. And so that was why he did it. Or it could just be he was a young male. I don't know how old Bilhah was, but either he forced himself or she said, hey, good looking, let's get something cooking. And then the last part of 22 says, now there were 12 sons of Jacob. And so now he has the 12th son, Benjamin being the youngest. And then we get a list of all the sons of Leah: Reuben, which is Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maid, Dan and Naphtali. Sons of Zilpah, Leah's maid, Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob, who were born to him in Paddan Aram, all of them born back there. Jacob, except for Benjamin, Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, what should I say, that's now called Hebron, or was then called Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. You don't hear any more about Jacob and Esau's mother Rebekah, so she's passed. Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now remember, Jacob was gone for 20 years. So you're still talking about a few more years to this point when he buries him. My point being, Isaac was blind when Jacob left. 20-some years have passed, and he hasn't seen a thing. Now, and like I said, Rebekah most likely has passed. She could have passed right before Jacob returned. It could have been years before. We don't know when. Now, chapter 36 is like a record of the descendants of Esau. Esau, who is kind of the founder of the country of what later becomes known as Edom or Seir, S-E-I-R. And so I'm not going to read through all this because it's a bunch of names that I can't pronounce. But I will kind of try and hit the highlights. Verse 1 says, these are the records of the generations of Esau, that is Edom. Esau took his wives. Remember, he took 3 wives. 2 were Canaanites, and the last one was an Ishmaelite, which was his daddy's half-brother's descendants. I'm not going to read all this. It says, Esau, verse 6, took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all his household, and his livestock, and all his cattle, and all his goods, which he acquired in the land of Canaan, because that's where Abraham and Isaac had been, went to another land away from his brother Jacob. For their property had become too great for them to live in together, and the land, and they were sojourned, could not sustain them because of their livestock. So Esau lived in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom, and that's what the country became known as. And then as verse 9 starts, these are the records of the generations of Esau. So then you get into all the names of his sons, of this wife and that wife, etc. and so forth. And if y'all want to read it, you're having a hard time sleeping. That might help get you started. But pretty much that is what all of this chapter is about. Such and such and such and such who had whatever. And just jump on over to verse 40 there towards the end. These are the names of the chiefs descended from Esau according to their families, their localities. By their names, chief, chief, and chief, 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 another chief, and on down all the way to according to their habitations in the land of their possession. So that's all about Esau. That's really about all you're going to hear anymore. That's his descendants. You could go through, and some of these names, you may hear later, not them personally, but their descendants come about. So then we get into Joseph in chapter 37. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan. He doesn't own it yet. These are the records of the generation of Jacob. Joseph was 17. Now, when he came back, I'm guessing he was somewhere around maybe 7 when they came back from Paddan-aram. So there's a few years difference between Joseph and Benjamin. So 10 or so years have passed. Joseph is 17. He was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the brothers of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to his father. Now, here's the question I have reading that. He's pasturing the flock with his brothers, along with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Well, the only true brother he has is Benjamin, who's going to be younger. Doubtful he's out there. So is he just, he's ratting on his brothers. Typical sibling, right? Is it just the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, or were Leah's there as well? It looks to me like just Zilpah and Bilhah. I can ask God when I get to heaven. Either way, they do something that causes Joseph to come back to Daddy Jacob and say, Dad, guess what they did? And y'all all had children, and if you had more than one, they never did that, did they? I know you had 2 boys, and they probably told on one another left and right. because I'm one of 3 boys, and we'll just leave it at that. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. He loved him more than the other 11. Because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a very colored tunic, or coat of many colors, as I was taught growing up. Was that right of Israel, to favor one? I mean, we're not supposed to favor one of our children? No. Not supposed to. We might a little bit. But he's favored Joseph a lot. And it's going to lead to problems. Verse 4, his brothers saw that the father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Had to be a tense household, don't you think? You got 11 sons that cannot speak to the one because they know Daddy loves you best. Who was it? The Smothers brothers. One said, Mama loved you best, or something like that. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Now, the dream came from God. You think, God, why are you punishing this boy? Except God has a plan, doesn't he? Joseph said to them, listen to the dream which I had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up, and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, he had still another dream and related it to his brothers. Lo, I had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him. He said to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. You know what I think? I think as they questioned him about bowing down to Joseph, I think God was giggling. Things happen in our lives and we go, why? I think we give God a good chuckle because he knows what's going to happen down the road and we don't. Our problem, most people's problem, we try and control our future and we can't. Joseph doesn't understand why he's having these dreams or really what they mean. But God's preparing or molding Joseph for the future. So verse 12, his brothers went to pasture a flock in Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing a flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said, I will go. Notice Joseph is willing. They won't even talk to him, but he's willing to go to them. Then he said to him, go now, see about the welfare of your brothers and welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. A man found him. Behold, he was wandering in the field, and a man asked him, what are you looking for? He said, well, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock. The man said, they've moved on from here. I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. Again, they hated him so much, they were so jealous. Now you see how much they were ready to put him to death. 19, they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him, throw him into one of these pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben, the oldest, the one that did what he should not have done, heard this and rescued him out of the hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into the pit that's in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." Reuben's plan was throw him in the pit. Later on, I'll come get him and send him home as quickly as he can get there. So it came about. Joseph reached the brothers. They stripped Joseph of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him, threw him into a pit. It was empty, didn't have any water in it. Then they sat down to eat the meal, and as they raised their eyes, look, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, it's the other side, with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, and on their way to bring them down to Egypt. They're going to trade. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brothers and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother of our own flesh," and his brothers listened to him. Now, what I find interesting here, this is Judah. This is who Jesus comes through. At least he's making a little bit of sense, but he's also got a little bit of greed in there. Don't take his life. Let's put a little money in our pocket. And then, now remember, Ishmaelites, they are Ishmael, Abraham's other son, by Hagar. They're descendants of him. So you look at verse 28. Then some Mennonites, traders passed by. So they pulled him up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelites, so they were together with Mennonites, for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now, the Midianites are descendants of Abraham and Keturah. The other one he took was his concubine that he had a number of children by. One of them's name was Midian, hence his descendants were called Midianites. So isn't it funny that here's Joseph who gets sold to Abraham's other children, descendants. I think God has a great sense of humor. But he also knows what he's doing. So, they sell him. He's gone. Verse 29, Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's not here. As for me, what am I to do?" You know, I'm the oldest. I'm the one the most responsible. So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the tunic in the blood, sent the vari-colored tunic, coat of many colors, and brought it to their father and said, "Hey, Dad, we found this. Would you examine it and see if it's Joseph, your son's tunic, or not?" So Jacob examined it. He said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." So Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son for many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters, notice daughters, not just one. Didn't realize that. Bible only tells us what we need to know. He could have had a dozen daughters for all we know. They arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph, him, in Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And we'll stop there tonight. Questions? We've heard that story about Joseph and the coat of many colors since we were knee-high to a grasshopper, haven't we? But it never gets old.
Do you think God still speaks through dreams?
Sure. I believe God spoke to me one time watching a television show. God can do anything He wants to, any way He wants to. Did you ever see the movie Lion King? I was a youth minister at the time, took them to watch it, and I can't remember how the line goes, but Simba and his dad says, "Our land is everywhere the light touches." And it hit me at that time, Jesus is the light. Everywhere you look is God's. Yeah. So God can speak in any way He wants to. I don't think it's as prevalent today for a couple reasons. One, we have this. God speaks to us through His Word. Where, well, you think in Joseph's day with dreams, they really didn't have much back then. In fact, it probably was all oral history in Joseph's time, not until really Moses is the one who started writing everything down. They probably had some written down, but like I said, Moses was the categorizer. But I said, God might give you a dream tonight.
He's giving me some awful dreams.
Awful?
Awful.
He's just warning you of what might happen.
I know. But I run till I give out.
He's just trying to get you some exercise.
Okay.
Well, I said, God can do just about anything He wants to, anytime.